Dr. Napier, I'm going to ask you next about the introduction of screening for AIDS. The key date there being October of 1985 was I think the official date, 14th of October, when testing of donations for AIDS was introduced, for HTLV3 HIV was introduced. Before we look at any documents, what was your understanding of whose role it was to decide on the introduction of screening? Was it for the DHSS and Welsh office, or for regional transfusion centres and their directors?
Well, the transfusion service would have articulated the need to have a screening service available as soon as the methodology had been advanced enough to make it workable. That the workability and the technical, specific biological details were very much in the hands of expert advisory groups who would consider the detailed specification of such tests and the important requirements in terms of sensitivity and specificity and reliability. Well, obviously, the transfusion service wanted a workable test as soon as it could be introduced.
Just ask you to look then at a handful of documents. The first is a letter to the Lancet, co-signed by you and a number of colleagues. It's PRSE 304824. This is the 2nd of March 1985 in the Lancet. If we go to the second page, there's in the right-hand column, there's a letter just over, or nearly halfway down the right-hand column, beginning, "We believe that the current commercial kits for HTLV3 antibody tests are likely to give a high rate of false positive results. We would therefore recommend that careful consideration be given before they're introduced for the screening of all voluntary blood donors, for the amount of and degree of unnecessary stress and hardship that a fair number of our donors and their families would thus have to undergo is unacceptable. This in turn could lead to a sizable drop in the supply of blood and blood products. Of no less importance for the safety of transfused patients is the need to ensure that the first priority for the introduction of any HTLV3 antibody tests into a community is given to patients attending special venereal disease clinics and other members of the general public who wish to have access to these tests. If this is not done, many high-risk people from a blood transfusion point of view may present themselves at blood donation sessions simply to find out their HTLV3 antibody status. We do support strongly the screening of all blood donors for HTLV3 antibody testing, but we would advise that this is delayed until test systems have been appropriately evaluated and efforts have been made to give all members of the public access to HTLV3 antibody testing." And we can see it's signed by a number of regional transfusion directors in England, Wales and Scotland, and we can see your name there appearing. Can I just explore with you the issues that were raised in the letter? The first was concern about false positive results. Why was that something which particularly troubled you and your colleagues, as far as you can recall?
Well, the action has to follow the recognition of a false. Well, first of all, you don't know it's a false positive result until some reliable confirmatory test system is put in place. If you just have a false positive result, the only action that could be taken is to inform the donor and give them advice to take appropriate measures. So it's absolutely essential that any result that's shown up as positive in screening is backed up by a confirmatory test, and move from a false positive status to a confirmed positive status, and then you have some concrete information that enables you to decide whether the donation is acceptable for transfusion, or alternatively, if it's not, then there's donor management has to be considered, what information has to be given to the donors concerned, and advice about their health and what actions they have to take, and what implications it might have in terms of their own family circumstances.
And to what extent, if you can recall, was the concern the stress on donors who might be told that they may have tested positive without transpiring not to be the case, as against the impact upon the supply of blood to the National Blood Transfusion Service? What was the relative weight accorded to those two factors?
Well, it would be another ingredient. As we've talked earlier, most blood services only just manage to supply adequately their regions, and the loss of any proportion of their blood donors could put the system under stress, and that might mean that the services can't meet all the requested needs. And so those responsible for the operation of blood services are keen to make certain that there's no unnecessary loss of donors from the donor panel.
The third point set out in that main paragraph of the letter is the concern that those in high-risk groups might present themselves at blood donation sessions to get tested. Why would that be such a problem if the tests would then screen them out in any event?
Well, it would be a problem because these were the very first tests being considered, and tests at this stage of development have both false positive results and false negative results. So there is an improvement over the not testing position, but you don't have the requisite confidence that you're catching all the potentially infective donations. If they had been 100% effective, then the concern that high-risk donors turn up at sessions wouldn't be valid. But these were early development tests. We recognised that they wouldn't catch all potentially infective donors. And so the last thing we would want is that those potentially risky donors take the opportunity to go to a blood transfusion service and get, in essence, almost anonymously tested, just to so that they would enable their own HIV test status. They know their own HIV test status.
So you and your colleagues in the last paragraph of the letter urged delay to the introduction of screening until there'd been appropriate evaluation and efforts made to enable public access to testing. Do you recall whether you or your colleagues had or voiced concerns about the length of time that the evaluation process took?
Well, I think this was always an ongoing debate, but we can only encourage those responsible for undertaking their tests to put their best efforts to evaluating the test systems under consideration. These aren't easy tasks to undertake. There'll be a variety of test methodologies to be looked at, and they all have to be evaluated against a set of criteria, such as their ability to detect low levels of infectivity, the proportion of false positive results they may get, the reproducibility of the test. In other words, do you get the same answer when you repeat the test on the same sample? So there are a number of considerations that have to be satisfied before a potential screening test is accepted as being workable in the transfusion service context.
If we look at a couple of documents from Professor Bloom, we can see he expressed a different view on this issue. If we start with DHSC 002489_099, This was a letter from Professor Bloom to Dr. Harris at the Department of Health, 31st of May 1985. He says, I'm writing to you to reinforce the views I've expressed at the meeting on the 29th of May concerning the rapid introduction of HTLV3 antibody screening of blood donors. My anxiety is compounded by the paper from the Middlesex Hospital Group published this week in The Lancet about the rising prevalence of HTLV3 antibody positivity in London. I think that not only haemophiliacs receiving cryoprecipitate, but also other groups, such as some patients undergoing open heart surgery or with acute leukemia, etc., could be at real risk of infection by HTLV3. I therefore think that one or more of the FDA-approved tests should be introduced immediately to test donations. Those which test as positive should be discarded, and the logistics of retesting, confirmatory testing and donor counselling could then be dealt with as separate issues. I think that donors would readily accept withholding of all positive results, that's been crossed out, but I don't know by whom, as an interim measure, because after all they are themselves potential recipients. I feel that such testing should be implemented immediately in order to preserve confidence in the blood transfusion service, and any temporary increase in expense would just have to be borne. Finally, I think you should know that I plan to submit a letter to the BMJ along these lines. Dr. Napier, before I ask you about this, I'm just going to put up the BMJ letter because the letter we've just looked at is probably not a document you'd have seen, but the BMJ letter obviously would have been a public document. PRSE 0001917. We can see this is published in the BMJ on the 22nd of June 1985, and it's a letter jointly authored by Professor Bloom, Dr. Forbes and Dr. Ritzer, and effectively it's a longer letter than the letter to Dr. Harris, but it effectively says the same thing. If we just go a bit further down the page, please, Shomik. If we pick it up in the middle column, the bottom paragraph, all these considerations underline the need rapidly to introduce screening for HTLV3 antibody for all blood donations. 3 commercial test kits have now been approved by the American Food and Drug Administration, and although there may be a small number of false positives, it's unreasonable to delay testing until this possibility is eliminated. Donations which are found to be positive for HTLV3 antibodies should be discarded. The logistics of retesting, confirmatory testing and donor counselling can then be dealt with as separate important issues, as discussed in detail in the excellent review of Osterholm et al. We believe that donors would readily accept this interim measure because, after all, they are themselves potential recipients. Although such testing will be expensive, we think that it should be implemented as soon as possible to protect recipients and to preserve public confidence in our blood transfusion services. Now, just pausing there, Dr. Napier, was this an issue that you and Professor Bloom directly discussed between yourselves, as far as you can recall?
I can't recall direct discussions with him, although there was a lot of debate exploring the 2 views about the implementation of testing. And one of the criticisms I think that was made as to why Britain seemed to lag behind the United States in its introduction of these early phase tests. I think it's important to bear in mind that the incidence of HIV positivity was vastly greater, if my recollection is correct, in the United States than it was in Britain. In Britain, although Professor Bloom has made reference to increasing HIV positivity in certain areas in London, but I think in general the UK population was believed to have a very low incidence of HIV testing, so the arguments that might apply about the introduction in the United States aren't necessarily valid in the UK. And in a population where the incidence of genuine positivity is low, then positives heavily outnumber genuine positives. And I have a figure in my head that at some stage it was such that about 90% of first stage positive results in these tests turned out to be false positives. If you take the same tests in a population where the prevalence of infection is much higher in the population, the ratio of false positive tests to genuine positives is much different, and the test becomes a much more useful test. I mean, there are a number of strands in the arguments for assessing these tests, and I think one of the criticisms of the early HIV tests was the tests didn't necessarily agree with each other. One manufacturer's test didn't necessarily show complete concordance with the results of another, and some of the test results weren't showing the desired degree of reproducibility. By reproducibility, my understanding is that if you repeat the test, you expect to get exactly the same answer next time, and that means that the control samples that are incorporated in every batch of tests, the weak positives that are incorporated, and the evaluation does demand that those weak positives are detected every time. There are controls that we know what the answer should be from those control samples. If a transfusion centre's testing protocols would have a system in which the correct answer has to be obtained from those controlled samples. They're put in there as known samples, and the analysis on any given stage has to confirm those results. If that doesn't happen, and we're dealing in the workload of transfusion service with a batch of, say, close to 100 donor samples, if the test doesn't give the right answer for the controlled samples, then that, in essence, invalidates the whole procedure. You can't, if it doesn't give the right answer for the samples that you know what the answer is, then you can't be sure it's got the right answer for the unknown samples. And that's a massive problem for microbiology testing and transfusion service. In essence, it's a bit like pulling the communication cord on an express train. The analytical process has to stop until you've understood what's gone wrong. And that delays the whole process of testing, and it delays your ability to issue blood products. It might mean a patient at the hospital is expecting platelets that evening, doesn't get them because the testing can't be completed until the fault in the system has been understood. So reliability of the test systems is an important consideration, and those responsible for evaluating the tests will very closely monitor the reliability of the test systems, and it has to be extremely high before it could be recommended for adoption into a transfusion service. So it's not a purely technical issue. It has repercussions in terms of the ability of a transfusion service to get through its workload and deliver its blood and blood components in a timely fashion.
Do you recall whether there was ever any discussion within Wales between you and the Welsh office, you and Dr Crompton as Welsh Chief Medical Officer, about the issue of an introduction of HTLV3 testing, and whether Wales should go it alone or plough its own course rather than await the outcome of decision-making by the Department of Health in London?
I don't think this would be a local Welsh decision. All of the transfusion services were in dialogue with the evaluation groups looking at these tests, and I think the feeling was to move in unison. As soon as a test was confirmed to meet the requirements of usability in the transfusion context, then we would adopt it, and not before so. And I can't see a scenario in which Wales would take a unilateral view, because we would be looking at the same body of expert advice as in the rest of England and Wales.
If we look next at DHSC 40406, this is a document entitled Screening of Blood Donations for Anti-HTLV3 in Regional Blood Transfusion Centres, report from the Working Party of the Regional Transfusion Directors Committee. The document dated the 11th of July 1985, and we can see there's the membership set out of the Working Party, and it included you, Dr Napier, as Director of the Regional Transfusion Centre. In terms of the introduction of the screening tests, we see recorded at paragraph 3, it was agreed that routine screening tests for anti-HTLV3 should not be introduced until the following had taken place. And then it essentially sets out the points which I think you referred to in the Lancet letter and have explained. So I'm not going to ask you again about that. But if we go over the page... sorry, I should pick it up bottom of the first page. I don't propose to go through this in detail, but is it right to understand if we look at the bottom of the page, there's a procedure or scheme set out as to what should be done depending upon how the initial test and then any confirmatory test results were reported. So if we go over the page, we can see a series of possibilities. Initial screen test positive, and then 4.3 repeat screening tests positive, or 4.4 repeat screening tests negative. Is it right to understand that this was an attempt to agree a common protocol as to how the test results should be responded to?
Yes, that's correct.
And then as I said, I think it speaks for itself. I'm not going to go through it paragraph by paragraph, but could we go to the next page, in the bottom half of the page? Just want to pick up what the proposed procedures were in relation to donors. So 5.1, donors would be notified that their donation would be tested for anti-HTLV3 and asked to confirm they agreed to the test being carried out. Donations will not be accepted from donors who do not wish their blood to be tested. And is that the process that was adopted at Cardiff?
Yes, it was.
And then 5.2 sets out what would happen if there was a confirmed positive result. A consultant from the Regional Transfusion Centre would write to the donor and an appointment be arranged where there would be counselling in the sense of an explanation of the significance of a positive anti-HTLV3 result. And then is it right to understand it would be referral to the GP of the donor with the donor's agreement? Was that the proposal?
Yes.
And as far as you can recall, was that what was done at Cardiff?
I think so.
If we then just pick matters up at the end of July of 1985 at PRSC 0002078. This is a document from the Department of Health 30th of July 1985 about the evaluation of the screening tests for HTLV3. If we just pick it up in the second paragraph, it explains that the first stage of evaluation had been undertaken on behalf of the DHSS by the Public Health Laboratory Service, and that had been considered and by a panel of experts. And then the National Blood Transfusion Service was undertaking its own second stage evaluation covering aspects peculiar to the use of kits in the blood donation screening context. Do you know why it was done in that sequential fashion, evaluation by the Public Health Laboratory Service and then evaluation by a second stage evaluation by the National Blood Transfusion Service? Was there any reason why that couldn't have been done in parallel?
Well, I think there are two aspects to test process. One is to, in the way that the Public Health Laboratory Service would have looked at it from a biological point of view, to see if specificity and accuracy were reaching the required standards. The Blood Transfusion Service will be using a simulation of routine screening with the sort of automated equipment available to do that. And they'll be looking at the aspects, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of reproducibility, to make certain that in large volume processing within the timescale that's required for a blood transfusion service, that the tests perform as they should do. The Public Health Laboratory Service won't at that stage be quite so anxious about whether the test system is how well it fits in with the blood transfusion services routine testing procedure. and they won't be putting through quite the same large volume of samples that the transfusion service will be able to do, so that aspects such as reproducibility and a better understanding of false positives is obtained. So they're looking at slightly different aspects, and I think it's probably, and I'm not able to be an expert in commenting on this, but it may be unrealistic for the blood transfusion service to put the large-scale evaluation of all test kits unless they've at least given initially encouraging results from the public health laboratory service. So that's my understanding of the two aspects to evaluation of test kits. There are slightly different criteria that have to be looked at in those two areas for testing.
I think just for the sake of completeness, it's also right to note that you wrote a letter to the New Scientist in August of 1985, rejecting criticisms about the delay in introducing screening. That's PRSE 0002548. I think we've essentially covered the issues that you, or the views you expressed in this letter in the answers you've already given, Dr. Napier. As I say, for the sake of completeness, you were responding to, I think, a contribution in the New Scientist which criticised the speed of the introduction.
Yes, and I mean, again, I can't trust my memory completely, but I think the New Scientist article was probably making reference to the timing of implementation in the United States as compared to that in the UK. But one of my points was the prevalence of HIV in the United States population that was being made reference to was vastly greater than the prevalence of HIV in the United Kingdom population, and so the urgency of implementation could be regarded as being rather different in the UK setting.
And if we look at the last paragraph on the left-hand side, to the long column, you identify there, as it were, the two rival considerations in the sentence beginning. The risk of this adverse consequence of testing donors must be balanced against the improved protection that will be afforded to transfused patients who are recipients of blood. And then you go on to talk about donor selection policies. This may be an oversimplification of the position, Dr. Napier, but is it right to understand you're here articulating on the one side of the balance is the adverse consequences of essentially of false positives. On the other hand is the Professor Bloom argument that the paramount consideration should be the protection to transfused patients who are recipients of blood.
Yes, that's the case, but I think it also has, I think these arguments have different weighting according to the prevalence of the virus in the population. Obviously, if for high prevalence areas, then the urgency to implement testing must be that much the greater. In the UK, as it transpired, and particularly in Wales, an extremely low prevalence area, and I think my recollection was of about one positive test per year. I haven't got the documents in front of me to confirm that, but it was a very low prevalence. And in that sort of scenario, we'd be dealing with a rather larger number than that, who were patients would have to be counselled because of rather inconclusive test results. And it's not easy to know what counselling that should be.
Can we then just look in terms of the implementation of the screening tests in the Cardiff area at NHBT 0092851. So this is, if we go to the next page, These are the minutes of a meeting of the Western Division of Blood Transfusion Service Consultants, 4th of October 1985, at which you were present. And if we go to the bottom of that page, AIDS update, it was accepted that there would be substantial amounts of untested long-life frozen components in circulation, mainly in hospitals at the time of the general announcement on testing. Centres were operating different policies for the use of this material. The testing of frozen stored red cells was also considered. It might have to be accepted that current stocks cannot be tested. Many donations were in fact collected before the prevailing epidemic. The washing and reconstitution might also reduce the risk of virus transmission. New donations obtained from past contributors could be tested, and when found negative, their preceding donations be certified as being safe. So the meeting is there identifying the problem that there will be stocks in particular held in hospitals, which, as at the 14th of October 1985, when the routine screening was introduced, wouldn't have been tested. Do you know what approach was taken in the hospitals which your centre served to this issue?
Well, my recollection is that the introduction of a new test, such as the HIV test, takes a considerable amount of time to get up and running. New equipment has to be commissioned and tested, and in effect the process has to be debugged. And I'm fairly sure that the Cardiff Centre would have implemented the HIV testing for a number of weeks. In fact, I think it might have been at least a month before the official live test date was announced. That being the case, all of the short lifespan products such as red cells and platelets would have been fully tested. In anticipating this problem, it would have been possible to run down the stocks of materials such as fresh frozen plasma and cryoprecipitate, such that the amount of these materials in stock at the changeover time, at the official testing date, the amount of this stock in stock that wasn't tested would be at its minimum, and it would be possible to discard it without undue jeopardy to the ability to maintain treatment to patients. I can't look at documentation and see discussions in the argument at that time, but I'm fairly confident that in Cardiff the testing began well before the official go-live date, with anticipating the fact that we wanted to be able to guarantee that at the go-live date virtually everything would have been, in essence, tested and safe to issue. And at that point, hopefully, the amount of long-life products, such as, for example, fresh frozen plasma, might be at its minimum and perhaps could be discarded without loss. I can't, without reference to...
I've got the document, I think, Dr. Napier, that will answer the question you posed. It's DHSC 0002489_140. This is a letter from you, 11th of October 1985, to consultant haematologists, chief MLSOs, including blood bank and unit general managers. And if we just look at the text of the letter, you refer to the introduction of HTLV3 antibody testing of all donations on the 14th of October. And then you explain that the Welsh Centre has been testing donations prior to the above date in order that, as far as possible, all materials issued from the 14th of October have been screened. Position is as follows. All red cell products, platelets, leukocytes, fresh frozen plasma and cryoprecipitate have for the last few weeks been screened and issued as HTLV3 antibody negative. 2, it's not possible to issue tested cryosupernatant plasma until the natural turnover older of stocks has occurred. This product will therefore be unscreened for some weeks due to the acute shortage of all protein products. We're unable to provide any alternatives. 3, emergency fresh blood and components will of course be issued untested and labelled as such. it's clearly understood that the clinical emergency outweighs the slight risk from the use of untested products. For existing fresh blood and, for existing stocks of blood in hospital banks will require review. HTLV3 testing began at the BTS on the 9th of September. I think you'll therefore find that all red cell components in stock will have been screened, but frozen products may not have been tested. So I think that bears out your recollection that in Cardiff, you'd anticipated the 14th of October date in the way described. But do you know whether other centres were taking a similar approach to the approach that you've described here?
I'm afraid I can't accurately reflect any conversations I might have had about this, so I can't elaborate further on that.
Okay. And do you know the extent to which the hospitals that had frozen products in stock that may not have been tested, the extent to which those were used? Was that ever reported back to you?
It might have been, but it's so long ago, I can't recollect whatever conversations I had. I think everybody was conscious of how serious the problem was, and I think every opportunity would have been taken to avoid the use of any products that hadn't been tested, but I can't elaborate further on that.
I'm going to move then to a different issue, which is in relation to an infected BPL batch and the procedures that were implemented in response to that. So a batch infected with, or potentially infected with HTLV3. If we start by looking at CBLA 5010_208. So you'll see, Dr. Napier, this was a letter from Dr. Snape at BPL to you, 3rd of October 1984, concerning a particular batch, HL3186, recorded as being at possible risk of AIDS infection. It refers to you having been sent 400 vials of that batch in August of 1984, and Dr. Snape having been informed that one of the donors contributing to the plasma pool was a practicing homosexual recently admitted to hospital with symptoms consistent with AIDS. And essentially a recall procedure was initiated with you being asked to return unused vials. There's a later letter from you, well, actually, I think a letter the very next day saying that you'd instituted recall arrangements. I don't think we need to look at that. But I want to pick the issue up with you by looking at DHSC 00011111. If we go to the next page, this is an internal report from Dr. Snape about the recall of this particular batch, HL3186, which resulted, I think, from a donation that had been made in the Wessex Regional Transfusion Centre. We just go to page 4 to see the position in relation to Cardiff. Under the heading Results of Factor 8 Recall, the 400 vials of batch HL3186 dispatched to Cardiff break down thus. Stocks held at RTC 150, Heath Park, Cardiff recovered 101 out of 150 vials, Morriston recovered 51 out of 60, Carmarthen 36 out of 40. Total of 338 vials was recovered. 9 patients received the batch. In relation to the patients who'd received that batch, was it then your responsibility to follow that up, or was that the responsibility of Professor Bloom in relation to the individual patients?
That would be handled by Professor Bloom and his consultant colleagues responsible for those haemophilia centres. So
your role essentially was to, because this wasn't a Cardiff donation, your role was essentially simply to gather back in the unused vials and return them to BPL?
Yes, that's true.
And then if we could just look at the next page, there's a general observation that Dr. Snape made that I wanted to ask you about in the last paragraph. He's talking about the particular donor who had donated, giving rise to the to the recall. And at 5.3, he says, the appearance of this donor at 3 different centres within 2 years clearly underlines a fundamental problem when carrying out follow-up of donor incidents of this sort. Surely central coordination of donor records is unavoidable. And without asking you to comment on that specific donor or those specific donations, do you have any observations on the general point being made by Dr. Snape about the difficulties arising when donors present at more than one centre and the absence of central coordination of donor records?
Well, I agree that's a valid criticism. My recollection is that centres in Cardiff included did report centrally details of infectious donors. What I'm not certain about is how that information was handled within the transfusion service as a whole. I don't think the details about potentially hazardous donors were shared throughout the transfusion services, but again, it's so long ago, I haven't got a perfect recollection of this arrangement.
And then just one further question on the issue of recall. If we look at DHSC 0002273_021, this is a letter from Dr. Snape to you, 26th of July 1985. It says, advice of transfusion incident and product recall notice PFC 795. And then he says, I've been informed by Dr. Krask that 2 batches of NHS factor VIII concentrate are uniquely implicated in the symptomatic HDLV3 infection in a haemophiliac. 140 vials from one of these batches, PFC batch 795, were dispatched to you on the 19th of September 1984 as part of your allocation for that month. The reference there to PFC batch 795, is that a batch from the Protein Fractionation Centre in Edinburgh?
I don't know. I hadn't noticed that particular labelling. It sounds like it, but I can't recall.
Okay. And you can't recall whether you routinely received products fractionated in Edinburgh?
I didn't think we did, but again, I cannot recall for certainty.
I want to come now to a further topic relating to testing, but now moving on to non-A, non-B hepatitis and the question of surrogate testing. So we can take that down. Thank you, Shamik. So testing either in relation to ALT or anti-HBC as surrogate markers for non-A, non-B hepatitis. In general terms, would you regard that as a decision for the Department of Health and Welsh Office, or for decisions of the regional transfusion centres in coordination, or was it a matter for an individual regional transfusion director to take their own course?
Well, there would be very considerable cost implications for doing this, and I think the Department of Health and the Welsh Office would obviously have a major role to play in deciding whether that was an acceptable use of public funds.
So it's not something you could have introduced without funding?
Well, I think had the case been, if we'd been able to make a particularly strong case to do that, then we'd be making our case to those respective departments to say this was high on our priority agenda. But it would have considerable resource implications, and these tests couldn't be introduced without the financial support from those departments of health.
I'm just going to ask you to look at a small number of documents on this issue, Dr. Napier. The first is CBLA 0002345. It's a regional transfusion directors meeting attended by you 8th of October 1986. I'll wait till we've got it properly on screen.
I don't know about other screens, but I've got a pretty picture of... it's gone.
Yes, so I think we've got a technical problem with the document. Should we try it again? CBLA 302345. Perfect. So we've got the date of the meeting there, 8th of October 86. If we go to the bottom of page 7, please. We can see the heading anti-HBC and or ALT testing. The chairman reminded directors that the possibility of screening for anti-HBC had been discussed previously, and that studies of the incidence of anti-HBC in the donor population had been undertaken at Edgware, Bristol and Manchester about 3 years ago. Developments in America meant that this topic must be considered again, as anti-HBC/ALT screening was soon to be essential for the accreditation of blood banks in the USA. The chairman proposed that the RTD should approach the DHSS to fund a prospective study of 10,000 donations to see if the incidence of anti-HBC had changed since this was last examined. He added that haemophilia directors were pressing for plasma for fractionation to be tested, both for anti-HBC and for abnormal ALT levels. It was agreed that a further trial should be undertaken at Edgware, Bristol and possibly Manchester. It was recognised, however, that even if the incidence had reduced significantly since the last trial because of self-exclusion or for other reasons, the introduction of anti-HBC/ALT screening seemed very likely. So as at October 1986, you'll see the regional transfusion directors meeting recording or anticipating the likelihood that this would be introduced. I don't think it was an issue in which you were necessarily very closely involved, Dr. Napier, but can you assist us with understanding why the prediction here of introduction didn't come to fruition?
Well, I'm a little surprised to see that statement, but the arguments were finely balanced as to the benefits of introducing these tests. I mean, in particular, ALT has increased levels of these liver enzymes, not only markers of possible liver damage and possible HCV infectivity, but also reflect raised alcohol intake or obesity or a number of other factors. So it's a rather poor discriminating test and only limited value, not no value, but some but limited value in terms of excluding potentially infective donors. And so I think there were varied points of opinion as to whether the value in reducing the infectivity of the donor pool could be balanced against the costs of introducing the test and the unnecessary loss of donors that would also take place. And I think as transfusion service directors, we're aware that we have to have a very cogent argument to take to health authorities for funding. Health authorities will say that money spent in this direction, if we want ALT testing, for example, has to be taken away from another area of healthcare. So it's not necessary that sometimes you're trading health gains in one area for health gains or losses in another area. So I think we recognise we'd have to have a very strong case to take to health authorities that these would be a significant improvement in blood safety.
The matter was considered again at a regional transfusion directors meeting in January of 1987, and we've got 2 records of that meeting, and they record contributions from you. I want to look at both of them and then ask you about it. So the formal minutes of the 21st of January 87 RTD meeting are at CBLA 00023588_001. And if we go to the bottom of the second page, we can see under the heading anti-HBC and ALT screening, Dr. Gunston reported that the Working Party on Transfusion-Associated Hepatitis was due to meet on the following day to finalise a proposal to the DHSS to fund a limited study of 12,000 donors. And then if we just skip over the next couple of sentences, it records you saying, or asking if consideration had been given to a study beginning with transfused patients he, the minutes suggest that this is you, was unhappy about the poor association between the markers in question and transmission of the virus. And then it records Dr. Gunson reporting that it had been discussed but was felt to be costly, difficult and not practical. So that's the first record of this meeting. If we can then just look at the second record of the meeting, SCGV 5069_059. So these are an attendee's notes on this meeting. If we go to the bottom of the second page, we go to the very bottom, we've got heading matters arising from meeting 201, and then there's reference at B to the request to the DHSS for funds to test these 12,000 donors. And then it records Dr. Napier spoke very strongly against the whole requirement for a prospective study into non-A, non-B through surrogate testing on lack of any scientific evidence that it would be useful. I don't know whether either of those documents assist you in recalling what your own thinking was at the time, but they read as though you are opposed even to the study being undertaken. Is that correct? And if so, why?
Well, I agree that's the way it reads. I think I must have been much better acquainted at that time about other international studies on the association of positive markers for surrogate testing and the impact or lack of impact on improving the safety of donations for transfusion. But I don't have in my head now the information that I probably was much more familiar with at the time.
Can I then just ask you, moving on later in 1987, to look at one further document, which was a letter from Professor Cash and colleagues at PRSE 301444. It's the bottom right-hand corner of the page. So this is the Lancet, 4th of July, 1987. Testing blood donors for non-A, non-B hepatitis, irrational perhaps, but inescapable. And then if we look at the end of that first paragraph of the letter, it says the introduction of, I'll pick it up slightly earlier than that. The last few lines in that first paragraph says the time for the study has already passed. Starting now will give us an answer in 3 to 4 years, and that's probably 3 to 4 years too late. The introduction of surrogate marker testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis is now virtually inescapable for 3 reasons. And then there are 3 reasons set out. The first is about product liability legislation and the likelihood that patients would have a claim if they contracted non-A, non-B hepatitis via transfusion of blood or blood product. 2 was about pooled plasma fractions and the risks of transmission in that regard. And then if we go over the page, 3, so it's the paragraph number 3, the UK transfusion services, although the major suppliers of blood and blood products in this country cannot afford to ignore the wishes of consumers to be supplied with non-A, non-B tested products, even if it's believed that the real benefit and safety which is offered to the patient is marginal. And then there are a number of further points made, but they include reference to the standards applied in the US, Germany, and France. And then if we go to the top of the next column, please. The letter concludes, just the very top of the page, please show me. Looking at these 3 factors, producers' liability, competition and value for money, we suggest that the decision which has to be made is when, rather than whether, the UK transfusion services follow the lead of the US and other European countries in donor screening. Do you recall whether you saw that letter at the time, and if so, what your response was to it? Well,
it's very likely that I did see it. I mean, there are the contrasting arguments being vigorously debated, and one fact that has to be borne in mind that you can't necessarily translate views and practices from one country to those in another. UK was fortunately a very low prevalence area for HCV, so the argument which might seem compelling in the United States didn't necessarily apply in Britain. There are questions as to whether how justified it is the claim, for example, the producer of blood products, that their donations have been screened by ALT testing, how valid they are. I think for large pooled products, any proposed screening system has to be highly reliable, and that doesn't apply to, for example, HLT or HGV testing. For such large pools, it's only the pool is damaged by the inclusion of just a small number of effective donations. And unless your proposed screening procedure is going to weed all of those out, you haven't achieved anything significant in terms of enhancing the safety. So I don't think the argument was a very valid one that introducing these surrogate tests necessarily will improve the safety of pooled products. So in that sense, I think that commercial liability is largely a legalistic argument rather than something that's based on sound science. But I'm aware that the arguments for and against surrogate testing were hotly debated. In the end, surrogate testing was not introduced in the United Kingdom, and I think that's because the arguments against the introduction proved to be more persuasive, and that's bearing in mind the cost implication of introducing testing. And so it's hard to say more than that at this stage.
It might be said that the UK was lagging behind other countries, such as the US, such as Germany, which I think had ALT testing for a very significant period of time by this stage, and failing to adopt a safety-first precautionary approach by requiring to be satisfied that this was sufficiently cost-effective. Would you have anything further to say in relation to that suggestion?
Well, I think you mentioned, did you say safety at any cost? I'm not
Well,
sure.
Safety first, a precautionary approach, rather than focusing upon cost-effectiveness.
Yes, well, I think everything we have to obtain resources to implement these procedures, and the cost effectiveness is going to be the most persuasive ones as far as health authorities are concerned, because they will rightly say that they're balancing health risks in different areas of healthcare. So you have to have a very cogent case for demanding resource support for any safety innovation that you're proposing, and I don't think we felt we could make that persuasive case.
Well, come on then to the final topic in relation to screening, which is the introduction of hepatitis C screening, which you'll recall was introduced in the National Blood Transfusion Service in September of 1991. I want to show you a couple of documents and then ask you some fairly general questions about this issue, because it's an issue we'll explore in more detail with later witnesses. The first document is NHBT 0000189_066. So these are minutes of a meeting on the 1st of March 1990 attended by you, and it's described as the 11th meeting of the Joint Working Group of the Welsh Regional Blood Transfusion Service. If we turn to page 5 and look at the bottom of the page, there's a heading HCV testing. Dr Napier reported that a Department of Health decision was awaited concerning the introduction of HCV testing. The revised bid for additional funding was noted. The financial implications would include not only the cost of testing, but also the cost of counselling the 0.5% positive donors and the loss of income from these unusable donations. It was noted that the revised bid for HCV testing would not be dealt with under the RSD mechanism, and there would be no need to submit the revised bid formally at this stage. Implications for the introduction of HCV testing would be reassessed once the outcome of the Department of Health's deliberations was known. Dr Trenchard, that's your Deputy Director, drew attention to the need to consider the potential implications for consultant physicians to whom up to 500 additional patients would be referred following positive HCV tests. So it would appear from this, or the note of this meeting, that it was regarded as a decision for the Department of Health. Is that your recollection?
That's the case. I think that at this meeting we were obviously gearing ourselves up to an anticipated go-ahead decision from the Department of Health. But I imagine there were high-level contacts between the members of the Department of Health and the Welsh office. So the Welsh office would have had some input into the Department of Health's deliberations.
Ultimately, funding had to be found from the regions rather than coming centrally from the Department of Health. Do you know why this was seen as something that only the Department of Health could sanction, as opposed to being something that the National Blood Transfusion Service, through its directors and centres, could introduce for themselves?
I think one important theme was that if testing was to be introduced, it would be uniformly throughout the entire service and hopefully coordinated such that the start date would be harmonised. So it wasn't a situation in which unilateral testing and funding was anticipated. That's unilateral, for example, the Welsh office would approve and fund the Cardiff Centre to introduce testing.
I understand, Dr Napier, the point about national coordination and doing something, everyone doing something at the same time, and we'll come on to that in a few minutes. But why could that not have been done through the regional transfusion directors and the national directorate, which by 1989 was in operation, deciding to introduce the hepatitis C screening? Why was it that the approval or a decision from the Department of Health was regarded as necessary?
Well, that decision would be endorsing the validity of the testing principle, so regions would then have a positive cue that this was something uniformly and universally agreed as necessary.
If we then just look... I'm sorry, Dr Napier, carry on.
I don't think it's a decision that any particular region would necessarily make on their own without reference to the total England and Wales attitude towards the implementation of testing.
But then there's just a second set of minutes I want you to look at. This is a meeting of the Western Division Consultants in October 1990, NHBT 0097472_050. So you'll see there the date of the meeting, 9th of October 1990. You were not in attendance at this meeting. We can see apologies were received from you. But if we go to the bottom of the second page, and the very last paragraph under the heading anti-HCV testing, the hope was expressed that the Department of Health would sanction sufficient funding. An application for £6 million has already been submitted for early initiation of anti-HCV screening, as the UK is falling short of standards set by most other centres in Europe and the US. So as at October 1990, that's what's being recorded by the Western Division. The UK is falling short of standards set by most other centres in Europe and the US. And it's another almost a year before the screening is introduced. looking at it now, or indeed looking at it at the time, was it your view that this process was taking too long?
I find it very difficult to comment at this stage without being able to firstly know how true it was that we were falling short of standards set by most other centres in Europe. I just don't have that information, and I'm not sure if I had it at the time. I mean, obviously all of us shared the desire that once a valid test that met our standards was available, we would implement it as soon as we could. I can't comment. I can't comment beyond this.
Do you have any recollection or indeed reflection on the role played by uncertainty over funding? We can see here the aspiration was that the Department of Health would provide funding. That didn't happen, and the regions were expected to provide their own funding. Do you recall whether that contributed to the delay? Would it have been quicker if Department of Health funding had been confirmed?
I'm not sure if it would. I don't recall the mechanisms for funding for this process. I don't recall whether the Department of Health altered its allocation to regions to facilitate the local introduction of screening. That may have happened. I just don't know at this point in time.
If we just move forward to 1991, just a couple of quick documents, Dr. Napier, before we finish this topic. NHBT 5076_006. This is a memo from Dr. Gunson to regional transfusion directors in England and Wales, 22nd of January 1991. I don't have a question for you arising out of this. I just want to get the dates clear. So we can see paragraph 1 refers to the Department of Health having agreed that routine testing of all blood donations for anti-HCV can be put into operation. And then paragraph 4 explains that financial arrangements to cover routine screening and supplementary tests have still to be concluded. So as at January 1991, the in-principle decision's been given. If we then look at NHBT 5073_065, you'll see on the 3rd of April 1991, Dr. Gunson wrote to all regional transfusion directors, and if we just go to the text of the letter, he refers to an intervening letter in February where the 1st of July 1991 was put forward as an appropriate date. And then he explains that there are now second generation test kits and the Department of Health has agreed, this is the 3rd paragraph, that there should be a second round comparative evaluation of anti-HCV test kits at 3 centres. And so the 4th paragraph explains that the commencement date is going to be pushed forward to the 1st of September 1991, so further period of delay. Do you recall now what your response was to the news that there was going to be this second round comparative evaluation?
I don't. I would have been aware of the technical arguments that were commending the idea that the second generation tests were much more reliable as blood screening procedures than the first generation tests. And we've already gone over the problems that arise when tests are implemented prematurely if they don't give the accuracy in terms of identifying the expected number of percentage of positive donations, etc., then there's an advantage in, as we anticipated, a relatively short wait until the more reliable tests were available. But I mean, I don't have in my head now the detailed arguments which justify this decision to postpone until the later date. I think we probably all shared I regret there was going to be a delay, but I can't recollect now the arguments for making that decision.
Now, Dr. Lloyd at the Newcastle Centre decided to stick with the 1st of July date. And so he communicated that in a letter to Dr. Gunson. I'm not going to put it up on screen, but for the transcript, it's NHBT 5074_014. I am going to ask you to look at a further letter from Dr. Lloyd, which set out his reasoning, Dr. Napier, and just invite you to comment on it. It's NHBT 5076_009. 24th of June 1991 from Dr. Lloyd to Dr. Gunson. He says this, at the recent meeting in York, it became clear the second generation HCV tests were acceptable tests for donor screening. The fact that many other countries have been testing for about a year now, and in some cases longer, makes the UK position look increasingly unrealistic and very hard to defend. The second paragraph, he says in the second line, I now feel comfortable that what I've done was correct and is defensible and provides the level of safety that patients in the UK could reasonably expect. Once the decision to start testing had been accepted in January 1991, any delay could only have been due to organisational problems, in which I include problems associated with confirmatory testing. The July start date was already a compromise based not on the best interests of patients, but on convenience for certain transfusion centres. Despite the fact that the second generation kits evaluation programme has not been completed, it's clear that testing must start come what may. And then he says, so I'll just read the whole paragraph, it's simpler. I think I've interpreted what you said correctly, and that you've told directors the testing must start in September 91 and cannot be delayed further. If this is the case, then the argument against my starting testing, that the second generation test kits had not been evaluated, was fallacious, as were the arguments put forward by several others who wrote to me. The only valid arguments are two: one, that I broke ranks, and two, that I did not give other centres adequate warning of my intentions. And then the last paragraph says, he apologises for not informing Dr. Gunson of his intentions earlier, says this: I could not take the risk of being forced to hold off testing until at least September and possibly later. This would have resulted in the transmission of hepatitis C to many patients in this region, something that was avoidable. And then over the page, I am very disappointed at the response of the transfusion centre directors in the UK over safety testing of blood supplies. The attitude appears to be very negative, and I think that the UK has fallen behind many other developed countries. We should be at the forefront, not just trailing along at the end. Can you recall what your view was at the time about Dr. Lloyd's decision to introduce testing adhering to the earlier date of July 1991?
Well, I was aware of it. I mean, his viewpoint contrasts with the viewpoint that most other people in transfusion services held, and all I could recall at the moment was that I was accepting that we implemented testing when we had a test of the highest standard of reliability and effectiveness when that became available. I think there are arguments for and against bringing forward an early, less reliable test, or waiting a little later for a more reliable test. But I think at the end of the day, Dr. Lloyd's viewpoint was outvoted by the generality of opinion, but it's hard for me to comment beyond that. We all wanted testing as soon as possible, but reliable testing, and I think most people felt that he did not agree with the action that Dr. Lloyd had taken, but that was his decision.
Just final question on this topic, Dr. Napier. Dr. Lloyd points out, correctly as we understand it, that the UK was later in starting testing than many other developed countries. Are you able to assist us in understanding why the UK took significantly longer than a number of other developed countries to introduce hepatitis C screening?
Well, I can't go beyond what I've mentioned already. I think comparison with other countries is difficult because many other countries had a much higher prevalence rate of hepatitis C in their donor communities, and so the chances of HCV transmission in those countries would be much greater. The UK, fortunately, was at the safest end of that spectrum, and that is one counter-argument for not necessarily following, tracking exactly what happens in other countries. But I agree, it is an argument of whether it's desirable to introduce a less satisfactory test early or wait for a better test. But as it happens, I think the consensus in Britain was to go to a level of testing that everybody felt confident were tests that were reliable in the setting of the UK Transfusion Service.
So I note the time. I've got a handful of further questions for Dr. Napier on a range of miscellaneous topics, but I might be best to take a break now.
Yes.
Can I suggest that representatives of core participants apply their minds over the lunch break to sending me any further questions arising out of the evidence that Dr. Napier has given already, because I've covered most of the topics now with him.
Well, you might then want a slightly longer lunch
Yes,
break.
please.
But before we break, let me just ask you a question arising out of that last exchange. You were invited to consider the position of the UK as against other countries, other developed countries, which introduced hepatitis C screening much earlier. And you said that part of the consideration might be that they might have a higher underlying rate of hepatitis in the donor community. But can I just try to explore with you how that works, in meaning that a test should not be introduced or should be delayed in its introduction? If it is thought, and you've told me a number of times that the transfusion directors wanted there to be a test as soon as there was one which was suitable, why would a test which was thought suitable elsewhere be regarded as unsuitable here because the rate here might be less? I don't understand quite how the rate of underlying infection has anything to do with the reliability or acceptability of the test.
Well, I agree. It is difficult. When the statement is that the UK has fallen behind many other developed countries, certainly some countries had advanced their HCV testing program. A number of other countries hadn't. That's not to say I'm not sure that the UK was necessarily an outlier in this respect. There may be many other countries which were at the same sort of stage of implementation as the UK. The UK certainly wasn't at the forefront of all of this, and that's the point that Dr. Lloyd mentioned. But I think your question as to why not introduce comes down to, I suppose, to the general criteria about when you introduce a test. There are advantages to introduce it insofar as you will hopefully improve blood safety in reducing the infectivity of the donor population, but there are also contra-arguments, which we have gone over, which again have a bearing on overall transfusion safety. And several times we've mentioned the impact on the donor population, the loss of donors and the blood supply. And most people in the transfusion service are well aware that blood supply is at times precarious, and sometimes transfusion services aren't always able to provide the blood that's wanted at the time that it's needed. And that is a very serious consideration. It's sometimes said, and it sounds a bit glib, that more patients die of the blood they don't get than the blood they do get. And so many people running transfusion services are very anxious that their their stocks are high enough to meet the sometimes unpredictable urgent responses. And so any implementation or any intervention which jeopardizes the blood supply is a negative factor to balance against the advances in blood safety that a test might introduce. It's a balance, and I think it's very difficult to say which side of the argument is most valid. All I can say is the consensus in the UK seemed to be to wait until the most reliable test was available and implement that. And I think in terms of the numbers of infections that will take place in a given country, it will have some bearing on the basic level of the prevalence of the virus in the donor community. And in Britain, fortunately, it was relatively low compared to some other countries. But I don't think there are any right or wrong answers in this question. I certainly haven't got any great clarity or any capacity to be able to defend the UK's position totally. I feel I went along with the advice that we were given and the consensus discussion that we seemed to be sharing at the time, but I can't say I can totally defend that against the contrary arguments. It's extremely difficult.
I follow that it's a long time ago, and you can't now remember precisely what the arguments were. My question was really directed to where the relevance of the underlying rate in the population. You've told me, and I understand, that a decision in principle to authorize a test and the expense that comes with it must take into account the effect or probable effect on the donor population, because if you don't have donations, you don't have transfusions and lives may be lost. I follow that, but it would appear at first sight, at any rate, that a country with less underlying infection is going to lose less donations and less donors than a country with a rather higher underlying rate, which is why I'm struggling to understand what the point was. It was going through your mind. I appreciate you're not trying to make an argument one way or the other, but you were trying to explain what arguments there might be. And if that argument was being used at the time, at the moment I'm struggling to see the logic of it. That was my difficulty. But
yes,
if you can't take it any further, then we'll leave it there, and I'll no doubt in due course I might get illumination from somebody who is more closely involved.
I'm afraid I'm not able to, clarify it anymore. But I think in a low prevalence area, if a test is an imperfect test is introduced, then the ratio of false positive tests to genuine positive tests will be much greater in low prevalence area. In a high prevalence area, that probably won't be such an exist. So in Britain, many of the first screen positive tests might have been false positive tests, and only with the reliable second generation tests and the reliable confirmatory tests, you then have a workable system where most of the test results you get are confirmed positive, and you don't get an accumulation of a large number of erroneous false positive tests. It is a difficult argument to discuss, I agree, but that's my understanding of it.
Yes, again, I'd welcome any help you can give me on the scientific basis for a test which intuitively you might think had the same percentage rate of false positives wherever it was applied, whatever population it was applied to, should produce a much higher proportion of false positives when the underlying population is much less infected. Can you help with any scientific explanation as to why the same test should do that?
Well, I think, and I'm not sure if I can, but there will be different attributes of a blood sample which might determine whether it's a false positive test, other factors in the blood which might lead to a false positive test. And that will be independent of the presence of virus.
I understand. I've got that point. Thank you.
So the ratio of false positives to true positives won't be the same in every population that's studied. That's my understanding, but I'm not a virologist, and I think I'm perhaps overstepping my mark of competence in this area.
No, well, you've been most helpful. Thank you very much. We'll take a break now. We'll have a slightly extended break. The reason for that is that Council will be fielding questions from a number of core participants, which will come to her, which she will ask of you on their behalf, as it were, after it's on the inquiry's behalf, after the break. And so we'll take a break until, would 2:30 be,
Yes, that should be
uh,
absolutely
the right
fine,
time?
sir.
Half past two, a slightly longer lunchtime, but if you're back at 2:30, please.